Woke is just the start. Everybody's been talking about being woke, about racism or about homophobia or classism. But being woke is just suddenly seeing it. And I remember what I was like when I was in college, which was a long time ago, but I can still remember it. I was at Washington U in St. Louis, and it was the middle of the 60s, and civil rights was a big deal. There was a lot of demonstration against the war in Vietnam. And, when you're young, you think you know everything. There's a lot of ideology, but not much experience because one is young. What can one do? The problem is that being really woke is a process of conversion. It takes time. It depends on where the individual is coming from and where they're going. I started in a progressive democratic household, and so I was in favor of what Martin Luther King Jr. was talking about, and against the war and all that. I say all that because I actually served eventually. So we're not always, we don't always have the courage of our convictions. But it's also a process of learning. My dad was an Episcopal priest, as am I, and he was in World War II. He was an officer, and he served at least one of the main deployments was to Guam, Saipan, and Okinawa with the Negro Engineering Outfit. All the officers were white, and he was the personnel officer, which is S2 in the technical term. And he grew up in St. Louis. He had played on teams with Negro players. He was in favor of open accommodations and those kinds of things. But to be in favor, idealistically, in favor of something and be progressive about it and really meeting with and learning sort of the cultural differences that we have and how to sort of bridge those gaps. The issue in racism is for people to see what they consider another race. I don't consider persons of color another race. They're Homo sapiens. So they're not another race. They are obviously an adaptation to high sun areas. My skin is an adaptation to northern climes where there isn't much sun. It's an adaptation. We're still the same race. But racism itself has a long and grim history. But it's not just learning the history. It's also meeting people of color, beginning to see them as equals. Now, none of us are equal in terms of body fat or muscles or whatever gifts we may have. Well, we have those gifts, and probably other people have them too, some of them. But we're not equal in that sense. We're equal as souls. We're not equal naturally, but we're equal in the best sense of the word. But to see somebody as equal, what that takes is not wokeness, but humility. Augustine said, how do you avoid sin? And he said, humility, humility, humility. But it's not just avoiding sin. It's also going through the process. I talked about my dad with a Negro engineering outfit. He had a sergeant, and that sergeant wanted to stay in the military. He had been a sharecropper in Mississippi, and he said, can you arrange it so I can stay in the military? And Dad said, well, we are reserve people, and you're not regular Army, so we have to get you constituted as regular Army if you are going to stay in. So that's what they did. They basically, he transferred him to a number of different units, and finally somebody lost his records, and so they reconstituted his records as a sergeant in the regular Army. He was no longer reserve, and so he spent his 20 years. And as we traveled around for my dad's job as a priest, every once in a while, this sergeant would show up, and they would go out and drink and reminisce if they could find a place. In Minnesota, it wasn't as hard as it was in St. Louis. But anyway, woke, okay, it's a big deal for a lot of folks, but it's an ideological deal. When you're woke, your ideology has told you this is the right way to think and do, but it is not necessarily really woke. Really woke takes humility. It takes reaching out. So if you're white, as I am, to people of color, to get to know them, to realize that they're people. And I was always sure as a youth that people of color could do high culture. So there were Leontyne Price and others who were great opera stars. I love opera, and so that's high culture. But people of color do high, low, medium culture. They do everything. They are people. They have been systematically abused and systematically mistreated and systematically discriminated against, and which is still going on. And it's, there is a built-in advantage if you have white skin in this country. To be aware of that advantage is to be woke, but to really be woke, you have to take your hat in your hand and begin to know people and to see them as people who you could depend upon, people who have problems and you can help, people who are your equal in terms of soul. Okay. Anyway, woke, just the start of the process. And just because you have a good, solid ideology doesn't mean that you're not prejudiced. I remember I had a lifestyle counselor in one of my congregations up in Minnesota, and he was an alternate lifestyle counselor. He was gay, and he was there for LGBTQ plus people. His name was Jim, and he had been a member of my congregation as a kid, and he was living in the same town, and at the university there in the same town, and he taught me a lot. Interestingly, he and his family were sort of at loggerheads. He was an embarrassment to his aunt and uncle, who were members of the congregation also. And I was supposed to be the priest for them and for him. And at one time or another, both sides asked me to renounce the other side. I didn't know what to do. I wasn't going to renounce them, but I didn't know quite how to handle it. So I sort of watched what the parish was doing, because they'd been around a long time, and I noticed that the parish had a relationship with both sides of the family, and they would deflect when the complaints would come up. They would just say, "Oh, that's not really our territory. It's your family, and we're not going to involve ourselves in your family." And actually, most of the people in the congregation, about half of them anyway, at that point, this was long ago, 30 years ago, they they probably half of them would not have seen their own homophobia. It's a little better now, but not much. And of course, gay people are invisible in the sense that they're in those days they were in the closet a lot, and so people didn't even know who was gay, except for the few people who were like Jim, who were trailblazers and prophets, really. But it took me a long time. I started out ideologically, I was in favor of, full rights for LGBTQ plus people, but there's a difference between being ideological and actually meeting people and talking to them and understanding them and loving them and caring about them and seeing them as human beings. Not as victims. I don't think that that's a very helpful way to look at people. It takes their power away from them. But as people who have been discriminated against, and to see them in some real sense as people that you're willing to talk to, people that you're willing to listen to their opinions, people that you care about. Now, obviously not all of them, not all people. I mean, there are bullies, there are all kinds of different people in every group. But we don't see that. Woke, it's a process, and it takes humility to avoid the sin. Sin being disordered love, the disordered love of homophobia or racism or classism or any discrimination against people who don't have the power to do much about it. So, woke is the start, but there is absolutely no place to feel smug about it at all. Anyway, that's what I have to say for today.